The wind that swept through the village that night was not a gentle one. It howled low and mean through the narrow alleyways, dragging the breath from every chimney and rattling the shutters like bones. Winter had arrived early that year, painting the world in tones of ash and bone, and the air tasted of iron and something bitter, like regret. Smoke from distant hearths clung to the ground in lazy spirals, and the moon, dim and veiled behind a curtain of clouds, lent only a meager light to the world below. At the far end of the village, past the frostbitten fields and the leaning gravestones of the forgotten, a midwife stood alone in the courtyard of a crumbling stone chapel, her lantern swaying in the wind like a weary star. Her hands were raw with cold, trembling slightly as she wiped them on her apron, and she watched the door behind her with a silence bred of habit and resignation. Inside, the cries of a woman in labor rose and fell, thin and wild as bird calls in the trees before a storm. The chapel had not housed a sermon in more than a decade. Ivy had claimed its bell tower, and rats lived behind the altar. But the stone walls still held warmth better than the open fields, and it was in that discarded sanctuary that the woman had come to deliver her child, refusing the shelter of the main house, the hearth, the clean bed, and the curious eyes. Her name was Brianna, though few now remembered it, and she had arrived in the village 8 months prior with nothing but a pack, a limp, and a belly that grew heavy with mystery. No one knew where she had come from. She spoke little, smiled less, but the priest had taken pity on her, offering her a corner in the chapel and the silence she seemed to crave. Now, the silence was broken. With one final cry, guttural and soaked with pain, the baby came into the world, slick and pale, fists clenched tight against the cold. The midwife caught her deftly, her breath misty in the chill, and wiped the blood and birth away with practiced hands. The mother did not ask to see the child. Her eyes were closed, her breath shallow. It was as if she had emptied her last ounce of will into the act of bringing her child forth, and now drifted beyond the reach of earthly sound. The midwife laid the infant on the straw-stuffed pallet, her own brows furrowed. Something was not right. The child's cry was delayed. Not the usual strong wail, but a soft, uncertain mewing that trembled like a reed in wind. Then she opened her eyes. They were dark, almost black, with a shimmer that suggested knowing. The midwife stepped back, breath catching in her throat. When the lantern light caught the child's face, there was a moment of terrible stillness. The marks were faint at first, like silver threads stretched beneath the skin. But as the seconds passed and her skin warmed, the lines grew darker, curling across her cheeks and forehead in web-like whirls. They did not resemble bruises or veins or wounds. They were symmetrical, organic, as though the child had been born from bark and flame rather than flesh. The midwife whispered a prayer beneath her breath, not in fear, but in awe. Still, awe easily curled into something else. When the chapel door opened and the wind swept in behind the village elder and 2 curious townsfolk, it took only seconds for wonder to shift into judgment. They came not to help, but to watch. Word had spread that Brianna was giving birth, and with nothing better to do on a bitter night, the villagers had gathered like moths to suffering. One look at the infant was enough. The elder's mouth tightened. One of the women made the sign of protection against evil, subtly, with fingers folded near her breast. "What is it?" someone whispered. "Not who. What?" The midwife wrapped the baby quickly in a woolen cloth, shielding her from the gazes. But the words had already taken root. "Cursed," said another, softer, as if speaking the word too loudly might make it true. The child let out a sigh then, one hand reaching blindly toward the midwife's neck, where an old chain glinted faintly. The motion was not strange, but somehow it unsettled them more than if the infant had screamed. Something about the quietness of her being, the way her eyes tracked sound rather than light, made the villagers uneasy. A man turned away, muttering about witchcraft. Another murmured of old tales, of forest spirits born in human guise, marked so they might be cast out from the tribe before they brought ruin. The mother never spoke again. She lived only long enough to hold the edge of the swaddle with one weak hand, brushing her child's brow once with thumb already cold. The midwife buried her behind the chapel at dawn, alone but for the child in her arms and the wind scraping frost from the stones. There was no funeral. The village did not claim her in death, just as it had not in life. The child remained nameless for 3 days, until the midwife, moved by dreams she would not speak of, named her Alara, a name from her own grandmother's songs, one not found in the village registries, and thus safely unclaimed by the tongues that gossiped. Alara, the name curled warm and certain in the midwife's throat, as though it had been waiting there all along. The days that followed were neither cruel nor kind. They simply were. Life in the village returned to its rhythm. Goats were milked, bread was baked, water was drawn from the well and lugged through the brittle snow. But the chapel remained a place most avoided now. Children dared each other to run past its doors, laughing too loudly as they passed, as if noise could drown out unease. The midwife, who now served more as caretaker than guardian, raised Alara in the shadow of half-spoken warnings. No one told her to leave. No one threatened. But doors no longer opened when she passed. Trades became curt, coins given less freely. And yet, Alara grew. By her first spring, she had learned to walk, though her steps were uncertain and tilted slightly to the left. By her second, she spoke in fragments, names of birds, colors of leaves, odd snatches of rhyme that no one had taught her. The scars on her face did not fade. If anything, they deepened, becoming a permanent map across her skin. They did not hurt her. They did not bleed or rise. They simply were, a part of her, as much as her breath or her bones. She would sit often by the old chapel window, tracing the frost with her fingers, watching the village children run and tumble in the fields beyond the cemetery. Her eyes did not envy. They watched, quiet, a little too still. The midwife sometimes caught her humming lullabies that Brianna had never sung. When asked where she had learned them, Alara would only shrug. She was not unkind, not angry, but even in her earliest years, she knew she was separate. She saw in the way the villagers' eyes slipped over her like rain-down oil glass, how they never settled, never softened. She learned not to wave, not to smile first. The lessons were not taught. They seeped in, absorbed like damp into wood. Some of the older women whispered that children like her had always been born on nights like that one, nights where the moon didn't show its face. Some believed she'd grow into her power. Others waited for a sign that she should be feared. And in their waiting, they created it. But Alara did not grow wicked. She grew quiet. She learned the names of plants before the names of people. She learned to mend bird wings before she learned to stitch cloth. She kept the edges of things, doorways, paths, fields. But always she watched. Always she remembered. And deep inside, a part of her knew something the others didn't. Her scars were not curses. They were something else. Not warnings, but invitations, etched stories written in a language no one else bothered to read. That spring, as the thaw came late and flowers bloomed only from the cracked earth near the chapel's graves, the midwife watched Alara crouch beside a sleeping fox, her palm resting lightly against its ribs. She didn't speak. She just listened, as if the animal's breath told her something worth knowing. The midwife felt a strange shiver pass through her, not fear, but certainty. The kind that settles in the chest and stays there. The village would never love her. That much was clear, but would learn one day to owe her. And that, too, was a kind of belonging. By the time the snow had vanished from the fields and the river unspooled itself from winter's grasp, Alara was 6 years old and had already learned that there were places she was not meant to linger. The orphanage loomed at the edge of the village like a wound stitched half-heartedly into the land, a long, sagging structure of gray wood and moss-covered stone that leaned slightly to the east, as if bowing in exhaustion. Inside its walls, laughter lived in abundance. Bright, shrill, clattering sounds that echoed up the stairwells and ricocheted off the rafters like wind chimes too eager to please. But that laughter did not belong to her. It skirted past her ears like a stream that refused to soak her feet, always flowing around her, never through. The other girls were not cruel in ways they could be punished for. They did not hit or jeer, not often, not openly, but they knew how to exclude with precision. They formed circles tight enough that no breath could pass between, whispered secrets with backs turned just slightly too long, and invented games with rules that shifted whenever Alara dared to ask to play. Her presence altered the temperature of the room, quieted conversations, slowed movement, introduced unease that nobody would admit aloud. The scar maps that laced her cheeks were no longer a shock to those who lived with her, but they remained a barrier, a reminder of something unspoken, something that children could sense even when they could not explain it. To them, Ilera was not frightening. She was simply other. And in childhood, otherness was its own kind of isolation. The matron, a grizzled woman named Hesta, with a voice like grinding stone, insisted that all the children were equal in her eyes, but even she paused a beat too long when brushing Ilera's hair or folding her linens. Once, Ilera had caught her staring too hard at the child's face in the dawn light, as if hoping the morning might have softened the markings. But they were always the same, deep and symmetrical, like carved runes beneath her skin. Hesta never spoke of them, but her silence shaped the air between them just as surely as words might have. Ilera learned not to ask questions she already knew the answers to. In those first years, she tried to belong. She mimicked the way the other girls tied ribbons into their hair, tried to laugh when they did, tried to share the crust of her bread in hopes of some gesture returned. She offered a doll she had stitched herself, its head too large, its eyes uneven, to a girl named Merla, who took it with a wary smile and left it by the well the next morning, soaked through and gnawed at by rats. Ilera found it there limp and sagging and did not cry. Not then. Instead, she picked it up, wrung out the water, and carried it with her to the woods. The woods began as escape. They were thick and untamed, curling at the edge of the orphanage like a sleeping beast, shadowed by black pines and tangled brush. The matron warned against them, spoke of wolves, of deep holes that swallowed children, of spirits who sang with the voices of lost mothers. But Ilera felt none of that. The first time she stepped between the trees, something in her body eased. The air changed. It tasted of loam and green things, of bark and distant rain. The forest did not flinch when it saw her. It did not turn its face away. It simply received her. In those woods, she began to uncoil. She learned the sounds of birds, not just their calls, but the pauses between, the rhythm of wings, the weight of silence before flight. She traced the veins of leaves with her fingertips and pressed them between pages of old books stolen from the chapel's forgotten shelf. She learned to identify mushrooms by their smell, their texture, the shape of their undersides. She began to name things in a language that felt older than words, one shaped more by intuition than by rules. The woods became a refuge, but also a mirror. Here, among things wild and unshaped, she did not feel monstrous. She felt aligned. There was a tree she returned to often, one with a split trunk that opened like an old woman's mouth, wide and secretive. Inside the hollow, she stored her treasures, bits of colored glass, a spoon with a bent handle, feathers, the crumbling doll she had rescued. She arranged them carefully, not as offerings, but as reminders. Each object held a feeling, a memory, a weight that kept her anchored. She began to speak to the hollow, not expecting answers, but giving voice to her thoughts in a space where no one could twist or quiet them. She spoke of the dreams she couldn't describe, dreams of water that glowed, of hands made of wind, of stars pressed into her skin like braille. She spoke of loneliness not as pain, but as weather, something that passed through, that shaped her but did not stay. One afternoon, deep into a spring that smelled of crushed mint and wet stone, she found a bird with a broken wing. It was lying beneath a nettle bush, eyes wide with fear, body trembling. She crouched beside it for a long time, not reaching, simply watching. Eventually, it stopped struggling, its breath shallow but steady. Ilera gathered it gently, wrapping it in the hem of her tunic, and carried it back to her tree. She used twine stolen from the matron's sewing box to splint the wing and bits of soaked bread to coax it to eat. She kept it there for 5 days, visiting each morning and night, until the bird was strong enough to flutter short distances. She did not name it. She simply let it go when it was ready, and as it rose into the gray sky, awkward at first, but growing steadier with each beat of its wings, something in her chest lifted with it. She began to spend more time away from the orphanage, slipping out before sunrise and returning after dusk, her pockets full of stones and seed pods, her hair tangled with burrs. The matron scolded her once, twice, but then stopped. There was a quiet agreement. Ilera was easier when left alone. The other children had stopped pretending to include her, and Ilera had stopped hoping for it. Her eyes held the stillness of deep water, the kind that unsettles even when calm. The girls whispered that she spoke to animals, that her scars changed shape when she was angry. They dared each other to follow her into the woods, but none ever did. And still, Ilara watched them, not with envy, not with hate. She simply observed, cataloging their habits, their small cruelties and kindnesses. She saw the way one girl, shy and prone to stuttering, cried at night when she thought no one heard. Ilara once left a single honeyed plum beneath her pillow, never claiming it. She saw another, brash and loud, steal bread from the pantry, not out of hunger, but fear of being forgotten. Ilara said nothing. She stored it all like stones in her tree hollow, small truths that did not need to be told. By the time she was 10, the forest had become an extension of her body. She moved through it without breaking branches, knew which roots would trip, which flowers close at dusk. She began to dream of the forest even when she was not there, dreams where the trees whispered her name, not with voices but with rustling leaves, with shifting shadows. She began to believe that the woods had chosen her, or perhaps that she had been born from them, that her mother had not died in childbirth but returned to bark and wind, leaving Ilara behind to remember. One morning, long before the sun had risen, she stood barefoot by the edge of the river, watching the fog drift across its surface like torn lace. Her hands were stained with blackberry juice, her hair damp from dew. She heard a sound then, far off, yet close, a low keening, almost human, almost animal. She followed it without fear, her feet cutting silently through the underbrush, until she came upon a fawn lying in a bed of crushed ferns, blood thick around its flank. Its breath came in shallow bursts. Ilara knelt beside it, her fingers trembling for the first time in months. She could not save it. That much was clear. The wound was deep, and the life already fleeing. So she did what she could. She placed one hand over its chest, the other over its eyes, and sang. A low, broken song, one without melody, more vibration than tune, the kind of sound that felt borrowed from the earth itself. And as she sang, the fawn grew still. Its breathing slowed. When it stopped, Ilara did not move. She sat with it until the light changed, until the sky turned from slate to pale gold. She buried it beneath the ferns, marking the place with 3 stones stacked atop each other. That night, as she lay in her narrow cot, back beneath the orphanage roof, Ilara dreamed of a voice, one not her own, not quite human, but speaking in words she somehow understood. The voice said, "You are not forgotten." She woke with the shape of those words still in her mouth, like fruit she had never tasted but always known. And in her chest, something stirred. Not joy, not fear, but the first hint of purpose, small and certain as a seed cracked open underground. By the time Ilara was 16, the forest had folded itself into her bones. She no longer walked its paths as a visitor, but as something native and necessary, a piece of the woodland mosaic too deeply rooted to remove. The orphanage, with its sagging walls and endless drudgery, had grown into a dull hum in the background of her life, a place of dry bread, clattering pans, and the scraped silence of girls who no longer bothered to taunt her, but still stepped aside when she passed. She had outlasted them, most of them at least. The older girls had gone on to become laundresses or kitchen maids, some married off to farmers in neighboring villages, others claimed by the mills or the sea. Ilara had remained, unclaimed and uninvited, folding herself into forgotten corners where dusk gathered and no one thought to look. She worked when she was told to, silent and obedient, but her eyes were always elsewhere. She saved her true self for the woods. It was in the forest that she first discovered the grimoire, though at the time she didn't know to call it that. It had been buried beneath a collapsed, rotting log, tucked inside a leather satchel gone gray with age and damp. She had tripped over it while chasing a hare, her foot catching on a vine, sending her sprawling into the brush. The satchel split open on impact, revealing a worn book, its spine cracked and pages swollen from rain and time. The writing inside was nearly illegible at first, curling script in faded ink, smudged with mud and thumbprints long since turned to memory. But something in her stilled when she touched it, as though a door inside her had opened and she was breathing air meant only for her. She took the book back to her hollow tree, the one with the split trunk that had served as her sanctuary for years. There, in the hush of dusk, she began to study it. The words came slowly. Many of the entries were more drawing than text. Careful renderings of herbs, their stems and leaves labeled in archaic terms, annotated with lunar symbols and faint charcoal diagrams. Some pages were written in a language she didn't recognize, but even then, meaning clung to shapes like scent of smoke. She deciphered what she could, memorizing the sketches, the rituals, the warnings scrawled in the margins. The ink smelled faintly of lavender and something burnt. She would press her face to the pages and inhale, eyes closed, as if trying to breathe in whoever had written it. The midwife, old now and slow by time, noticed a change in her, not in words, but in the quiet ways a woman who has seen many lives will observe another. She saw how Alara's fingertips became green-stained, how her pockets filled with dry bark, crushed flower heads, sprigs of thorn. She watched her begin to hum when she thought no one was near. Low rhythms that didn't belong to any song the village children knew. The midwife did not question it. She had her own memories of mothers who whispered to the moon and grandmothers who left salt on windowsills. Instead, she gave Alara space and occasionally, without a word, left small offerings on her cot. A fresh spool of thread, a cracked ceramic mortar, a scrap of waxcloth that once belonged to a healer now long buried. Alara accepted each without thanks, knowing that thanks were not necessary between those who understood what silence could mean. As the months passed, her hands grew more confident. She began to mix salves from beeswax and crushed marigold, boiled teas from dried elderflower and fennel root, steeped tinctures that stung the tongue but eased fever. She learned how to test a plant for poison by the curl of its leaf, and the color it bled when broken. The grimoire became her scripture, its pages her prayers. She copied it by hand into scraps of parchment and cloth, weaving her own observations into its margins until the knowledge no longer felt borrowed, but born. One late summer morning, a small boy from the village came limping to the orphanage gate, a rag tied around his leg and his face tight with pain. A rusty nail had pierced the flesh above his ankle 2 days earlier, and his skin was now swollen, flush with infection. The matron turned him away. "We have no doctors here. Go home to your mother." But Alara saw the wound before the gate closed. She stepped forward before she could talk herself out of it, and with a steady voice, asked the boy to sit. He hesitated, frightened more by her face than his injury, but the pain was stronger than his fear. She washed the wound with boiled nettle water, sprinkled it with powdered goldenrod, and wrapped it tightly with a strip of clean linen soaked in calendula oil. The boy watched her, wide-eyed and silent, as she worked. He didn't speak until she stood and told him to return the next day for another wrap. Then, in a voice small and high with disbelief, he said, "It doesn't hurt anymore." She didn't smile, but she nodded once. "It will if you don't come back." And then she turned, walked away, leaving the boy gaping at her shadow. Word spread slowly, but it spread. A man with a cough that hadn't broken for a week came to her next, then a girl with a rash so red it bled. They came quietly, after dark, often with downcast eyes and clenched hands, as though unsure whether they were asking for help or committing a sin. She took them all. She did not ask for coin or thanks. Her payment was trust, reluctantly given and slowly earned, and it was more valuable than silver. The villagers still did not look her in the eye when they passed her on the road. They still crossed themselves under their breath, still pulled their children closer when she neared. But when their loved ones were sick, when fever took hold or the winter brought bone-deep ache, they came. And she healed what she could. Not all her remedies worked. Not every patient recovered. But her failure was never due to apathy. She worked with the desperate attention of someone who understood what it meant to be discarded, and who refused to let anyone feel that way in her presence. She began to keep a garden just beyond the edge of the forest, an untidy patch of soil where lavender grew alongside mugwort and yarrow, where foxglove threatened to overtake the chamomile unless carefully reined in. She tended it every day, rain or shine, humming low as she pulled weeds and whispered the names of each plant under her breath like a litany. Birds gathered there. So did insects, small reptiles, and occasionally a red fox with a torn ear who watched her from a safe distance, and once allowed her to set a bowl of water near its paws. One evening, as the sun collapsed behind the hills and the wind smelled of burnt leaves and fading green, Ilara opened the grimoire to a page she had not dared read before. The ink was thicker here, almost angry, the handwriting erratic. It told of a ritual not for healing, but for memory, a way to glimpse the face of one's blood before time swallowed it. It required only 3 things: a piece of clothing once worn by the mother, a feather from a bird that had never flown, and the roots of the moonflower harvested under a waning moon. She had all 3. She prepared the mixture in silence. Her hands were steady, though her heart felt like a bird flinging itself against the cage of her chest. When the brew began to steam, she bent her face to bowl and inhaled. At first, nothing. Then a flicker, a figure walking through snow, face obscured by wind and hair, a humming low and strange. Then another flash, hands tying ribbon around a tiny wrist, a lullaby sung in a language Ilara had never heard aloud but somehow knew. And finally, a single image, as sharp and fragile as glass. Her mother's face, not distorted by pain or loss, but calm, watching her, not smiling, not crying, just watching, as if waiting to be remembered. Ilara sat there until the bowl went cold. She did not weep, she did not move, but something inside her had shifted. A stone nudge loosened the wall she had built around her heart. She had always known she did not come from nothing. Now, she knew what had been taken from her. And still, she returned to the forest the next day, and the next, her fingers stained with dirt and fireweed, her breath full of root smoke and purpose. The world did not soften around her. The villagers did not gather to sing her praise. But they came, and she healed, and the earth gave her just enough to keep going. Then one dusk, as she bent over a pestle-grinding fever-feuded dust, she heard a rustle beyond the edge of the trees, a wing beat sharp and sudden, followed by a low, wounded cry. She stood slowly, setting the bowl aside, her body already knowing something had arrived. Not illness, not memory, but a new kind of test. A creature in need, perhaps, or something more. Something watching, waiting to change the course of her quiet life. The drought did not arrive as thunder or famine or fire. It came as a slow forgetting. It crept in on the back of still days and brittle nights, with skies too pale to be taken seriously, clouds that wander above the village but never broke. At first, it was nothing more than dryness in the throat, the kind that could be quenched with another ladle of well water. Then, it became the absence of dew on the grass in the morning, the way the fields lost their softness underfoot. The air grew thick, but never storm-heavy, only stale, unmoving. Wind ceased to rustle the trees. The forest, once so full of sound, fell quiet. It was as if the world was holding its breath, uncertain whether to mourn or endure. The villagers did not speak of it for weeks. They mistrusted the naming of things, believing that to call a misfortune by its true shape was to give it permission to stay. But the signs mounted. The river that curled past the northern fields narrowed to a stream and then a trickle. The wheat began to droop before it ripened, its color dull as clay. Livestock grew thin. Chickens laid fewer eggs, and the cow's milk lost its cream. The village well, which had never faltered in memory, began to taste of iron. The old men who liked to sit beneath the eaves and spit certainty into the dirt started to shuffle away earlier in the evening, their eyes tight with worry. And then the fevers came. They began in the youngest children first, as they often did. Small bodies, quick to burn. A boy named Oren was the first, his cheeks glowing with heat even before his voice cracked with a cry. Within hours, he could not stand. His breath came shallow, his skin hot and damp, but he trembled as though frozen. The village healer had passed 2 winters before, and no one had come to replace her. The next day, Oren's sister, Myri, fell ill, and then 2 others, boy from different homes, all pale and silent with fever that came like a tide and offered no exit. Desperation tore a hole in the silence. Ilara heard it in the voices that carried through the village square one evening, harsh and hoarse, as elders gathered and argued beneath the gnarled tree that marked the village center. She had come only to fill a jug with the last of the rainwater she had caught weeks ago, but their words reached her. Someone had seen the girl who lived half in the woods and half in the orphanage tending to wounded animals. Someone else claimed their sister's rash had cleared after a visit to the midwife's old garden, where Alara had been seen collecting herbs at dusk. There were mutters of suspicion, of gifts too close to the uncanny, but also of hope. Mutters, too. That hope was a dangerous thing to ask from a girl with a face like a curse. It was a blacksmith's wife who brought the first child to her door. The woman's eyes were hard, rimmed with red not from weeping, but from the effort of not doing so. She did not beg. She merely stood at the threshold of the garden and waited until Alara noticed her. She said the fever had not broken for 3 nights, that the village elder's tincture of bark and honey had done nothing, that her son had begun to speak of people who were not there, to cry out for his father who had died last spring. She did not ask if Alara could help. She simply knelt and laid the boy in her arms on the edge of the grass, then stepped back, arms wrapped around herself as if to keep from breaking apart. Alara took the boy inside. She did not speak as she worked. She had no words that would comfort, and none were expected of her. She moved with the calm certainty of someone who had already decided that she would bear the consequences of trying. She mixed elderflower and yarrow in the kettle that hung over the coals. She crushed willow bark into a fine powder, bound a paste of lavender and vinegar across the child's brow, and laid her fingers gently across his temples. His skin was thin as parchment, burning beneath her touch, and his eyes fluttered without seeing. She spoke his name softly, like a tether. She did not sleep that night, nor the next. She sat beside him in the flickering warmth of her hearth, whispering quiet nothings into the smoke, her breath steady even as hers faltered. On the 3rd morning, his fever broke. He opened his eyes and called for water. When his mother came for him that evening, she said nothing. She only took the boy into her arms, clutched him tightly, and bowed her head low before turning away. Others followed. They came with eyes cast down, shoulders hunched, often cloaked beneath shawls, as if hiding their knee behind cloth would make it easier to bear. Alara took them all. Old men coughing blood, infants who would not feed, girls whose bellies twisted with pain. She moved through each case with growing confidence, drawing from the grimoire in the garden, adjusting recipes when they failed, learning the language of sickness as if it were a song with infinite verses. And something changed in the village. They still did not speak to her in daylight. Still, when she walked past the well or the bakehouse, conversations would pause, eyes would shift, but behind those eyes, something else had begun to bloom, a flicker of recognition, a tether, the unspoken knowledge that she was no longer merely the scarred girl who haunted the woods, but something more, something needed. Still, there were limits. Gratitude in private could not translate to acceptance in public. One afternoon, when a merchant's daughter was seen walking home from Alara's garden with a bundle of thyme and rose hips, her mother slapped her hard enough to draw blood. Another night, someone threw a stone to the shutter of Alara's window, and she found a bundle of dead crows left at the foot of her door. Fear, she had learned, did not vanish with healing. It merely curled itself around its new shape and waited to strike again. But she did not stop, and when the fevers returned in the hottest part of the summer, harsher and more insistent, she was ready. This time, the illness swept through with deeper claws. The children did not wake as quickly. Some lost their voices. One girl, a flax-haired waif named Sella, stopped breathing entirely for nearly a minute before Alara revived her with a poultice made from crushed thyme, motherwort, and the root of a plant she could not name but had trusted instinctively. Sella's mother fell to her knees when her daughter opened her eyes again, and for the first time, someone in the village touched Alara's hand without flinching. It was quick, barely a brush, but it was real. In the days that followed, she moved like a woman possessed, not by rage or grief, but by purpose. She rationed her herbs carefully, split her tinctures with water and honey to stretch them further, and spent hours beneath the sun collecting bark and flowers from the outer reaches of the woods. Her hands blistered, her voice grew hoarse from chanting long-forgotten names, but she did not stop. She began to dream of fire, not destructive, but purifying, blazing behind her eyes each night, leaving her breathless and burning with the sense that something was coming, something larger than sickness. Then, one morning as she walked the path toward the chapel to retrieve rainwater left in barrels near the old stone wall, she saw a figure waiting beneath the sycamore tree. He was cloaked in traveling garments, the fabric heavy with road dust, and beside him stood a horse, so pale it nearly shimmered in the light. The man held something in his arms, a bundle wrapped in velvet and silk, too small to be anything but a child. His face was unreadable. He did not speak right away. Illyra paused, heart stilled in her chest. The man stepped forward. "They say you heal those others cannot." His voice carried no threat, no mockery, only desperation. Illyra said nothing, but her hands already reached the bundle, her mind turning toward roots and heat and breath. He let her take the child, and somewhere behind the silence, the world tilted again, reshaping the path she thought she had known. The falcon arrived at the edge of dusk, a silhouette against a failing light, broken in its flight, but defiant in its fall. Illyra had been gathering the last of her fever balm roots beneath the curling breath of honeysuckle when she heard the sound, a low, wing-heavy thud against the forest floor, followed by silence so sudden it rang. She stood still for a long moment, the breath caught in her throat, listening, not for footsteps or voices, but for the subtle tremor of life and pain, the way the forest sometimes whispered of something out of place, unnatural, in need. When the second rustle came, lighter, uncertain, she turned and followed it barefoot, her fingers stained with dirt and oil, the dying light threading between the trees in ribbons of amber and smoke. She found in the bed of nettles, half covered by dry leaves and twigs, its wings askew like wind-torn cloth. One of them bent wrong, sharply, bone pressing against skin where it should not. The bird's chest rose and fell in shallow gasps, its beak slightly open as if tasting the fear it could no longer flee. Its eyes, a wild shade of gold that seemed too large for its narrow skull, flicked toward her. It did not cry out, did not thrash. It only watched. Illyra crouched slowly, murmuring under her breath, not words exactly but tone, something low, steady, a rhythm made of breath and memory. She had used it on wounded foxes, on a doe that had torn its flank against thorns, on a boy who had come to her blind with fever. She reached out one hand, palm open and still. The falcon did not move. She carried it home wrapped in her shawl, arms cradling it like a child. Each step back through the forest felt like a prayer, though she had long since stopped believing in gods who listened. She placed it on a nest of linens by her hearth, dimming the fire to a gentle glow. The break would need binding. She could see that already, and the wing itself would have to be set in such a way that it could heal without stiffening, without losing the memory of flight. She opened her grimoire, hands careful, eyes tracing the notes she had made in the margins of older pages. Avian bone, poultices for bruising, binding salves for feathered skin. She read late into the night, candle wax spilling like tears down the copper dish. The falcon's breath slow but steady. In the morning, she began the work. It took time, long, deliberate moments shaped by quiet and patience. The falcon refused food for 2 days, but then took water from her fingers, and on the fourth morning accepted a sliver of soaked meat. Its feathers, once ragged and dulled by dirt, began to regain their sheen. But the wing remained bound, its healing slow and delicate. Illyra spoke to it sometimes, telling stories she had not spoken aloud in years. Tales of the chapel where she was born, the way the villagers used to watch her, as if waiting for her to ignite. She told her the first time she had learned to coax sap from wounded bark, how it felt like learning to speak again, but in a language that didn't need sound. She told her the children who came to her, limp with fever, and how their eyes changed when they woke to see her face and no longer feared it. The falcon never replied, but it watched her always, its eyes bright with something that felt too human for comfort. By the second week, it began to move again, dragging its talon carefully across the linens, testing the pressure of the wing against its side. Illyra loosened the binding slightly each night, then retightened it by day, afraid the creature might push too far before it was ready. It was during one of these evenings, her hands wrapped around the falcon's wing, breath caught in concentration, that the knock came. A sound sharp and sudden, not like the hesitant taps of the villagers, but firm, authoritative. Illyra froze, heart clenching, her fingers still mid-bind. The falcon tensed beneath her hands, but did not cry out. She rose slowly, wiping her palms on her apron, and opened the door to find a man standing in the path, cloaked in travel-worn garments the color of smoke and stone. His eyes were hidden beneath a wide hood, and a sword hung at his side, its hilt wrapped in black leather. But it was not the sword that startled her. It was the way he stood, too straight, too quiet. He held no torch, though the light had long since died, and he gave no greeting. "I've been told," he said, his voice low and even, "that you heal things that don't want to be healed." Ilara said nothing, only tilted her head slightly in question. "I have a wound," he continued, "but it's not on the skin." Now she spoke. Then, "I'm not the one you need." "You are," he said without pause, "because I don't need it healed. I need it understood." There was something in his tone that stopped her from sending him away. Not desperation, not arrogance, but familiarity. She had heard it in the voice of a blind child who came to her asking not for sight, but for something to hold in the dark. She stepped back, and he entered without hesitation. He removed his hood only once he was inside, revealing a face carved from silence, strong-jawed, lined with scars not of war but time. His eyes, she realized then, were clouded, not entirely blind perhaps, but blurred by something permanent. She said nothing of it. He did not stumble. He moved like someone who had learned long ago to listen to the world without using his eyes. He sat by the hearth without waiting to be told, close enough that the falcon hissed softly, shifting its weight. The man turned his head toward the sound, but did not move. "A broken wing," he said quietly, "like mine." Ilara knelt to continue her work. "Yours does not seem broken." He smiled, and for the first time, she saw weariness crack through his stillness. "I was a knight once," he said. "I fought for a king who no longer breathes. I buried my brothers in a foreign land. I came home to a house full of ghosts and a face no one remembered." He reached up, touched the scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. "They said I should rest, but rest feels too much like dying." "And so you came here?" she asked, not accusing, just curious. "I heard of a girl who brought dead things back from the edge. I wanted to see if she could do it for someone still breathing." Ilara looked at him then, not just the shape of him, but the weight. She saw it. The wound not on the skin, but beneath it, old and aching and worn. A man who had seen too much and been seen too little in return. She nodded once and rose to pour tea. Not the kind that healed bodies, but one made from mint and valerian, meant to soothe the spirit. She placed it in his hands without a word. He took it and drank. They sat in silence for a long time, broken only by the soft rustle of feathers and the crackle of fire. He returned the next day. And the next. He said little, but listened when she spoke. He helped her turn the garden soil, gather the more stubborn roots. His sword never left his side, but it hung now not as threat, but memory. Ilara learned his name, Bram, learned that he had once ridden in gold-threaded banners, slept in silken tents, kissed women who spoke of valor and destiny, but they had not stayed. The war had taken their shine, and his silence had grown too loud. Here, in this forgotten corner of the world, he found something closer to recognition in the rustling of leaves than in the applause of courts. Weeks passed, and the falcon grew strong enough to spread its wings again. One morning, as dawn crept like breath over the hills, it leapt from Ilara's hand and rose into the air, wings slicing the sky. Feathered shadow against flame. Bram stood beside her, his blind eyes turned toward the sound of flight. "It remembers," he said, "even after all that time. It still remembers how to fly." Ilara watched the bird disappear into the trees, and for a long moment said nothing. Then, as if responding to some quiet decision inside herself, she turned to Bram and asked, "And you?" He did not answer, but he stayed. Long after the falcon was gone, long after the fevers passed, he remained silent and steady as the stones that edged her garden. And one day, when the wind shifted and the scent of burning oil reached them from the south, they both understood. The world beyond their quiet refuge had not forgotten them either. The city had always seemed to exist in another world, one made of polished stone and practiced elegance, where hands were scrubbed clean of soil and voices echoed in marble corridors rather than across meadows and woodlands. Ilara had never seen it, never even dreamed of it in a way that made it feel reachable. The capital was a name whispered behind cupped hands, a story for those born with silk at their necks and the leisure to gaze at maps instead of weather. It held no place in her imagination, no thread in the loom of her daily thought. Her life had always been in the hush of moss, in the steam of herbs, in the quiet weight of healing. Yet the capital came to her one brittle morning in the form of a letter clutched by a trembling stable boy whose boots still carried the city's filth. He arrived just as the frost was beginning to melt from the garden beds, his breath ragged, his eyes too wide for his age. Illyra had been inspecting the rhubarb, noting how the stalks curved up despite the cold. When the boy stumbled toward her, mud caked along the hem of his cloak, an emblem she did not recognize pressed against his shoulder. He was too thin, too frantic, and the moment he saw her face, he froze. His eyes flicked across her scars, lingered in that familiar way. The hesitation, the recoil, the effort to look without seeming to look. But there was no time for cowardice in him. He drew a folded paper from inside his coat and held it out with shaking fingers. "They said I must find the healer of the Glen," he said, voice rasping from exhaustion. "The one who brought a child back from the threshold. They said, please, she's dying." The parchment was heavy, its edges embossed, the wax seal marked with symbols she had only seen once, in a worn book about the monarchs of South, a lion's mane made of fire, circled in stars. She broke it with steady hand and read the letter, the script elegant but rushed. The words struck like cold iron. "My sister Felice lies near death. The finest physicians have failed her. If the stories are true, I beg you to come. We will meet any terms. Prince Nikolai of Dirath." She read the name again and again, but it did not sink. Royalty was not something that touched her world. She knew hunger, fever, sorrow, and the ache of loss that curled beneath ribs and made breath a labor. But princes? That belonged to a realm of tapestries and parades, not to the dirt beneath her nails or the smoke that clung to her skin. And yet, the urgency in the letter's lines was unmistakable. Desperation written in curving ink. The kind of plea that came not from pride, but from the shattering grief of watching someone beloved slip beyond reach. Illyra packed quickly. She chose only what was necessary. Tinctures, dried roots, bundles of wrapped herbs, and a small flask of moonflower oil she had distilled only once and never used. She bound them in cloth and leather, tied her shawl across her shoulders, and placed her grandmother's grimoire inside the satchel with careful hands. Bram watched her from the doorway, arms folded, his blind gaze steady. He asked no questions. She turned to him, her voice low. "I may not come back." He nodded once. "Then go as far as the world will need you. I will remain here. For the returning." The road to the capital stretched over 3 days, each one colder than the last. They rode on borrowed horses, the stable boy pale with fatigue. Illyra silent as she listened to the way the wind changed near the city's edges. The trees thinned, the hills smoothed out into fields of dying wheat and dusty tracks, and then the walls of the capital rose up before them, too large, too clean. Illyra stared at them with a kind of grim reverence, understanding for the first time what it meant to be small not in soul, but in context. The city breathed differently. It inhaled power, exhaled ritual. Guards in crested armor stopped them at the gates. The boy stepped forward with practiced haste, shouting the name of his prince, and after a tense pause, they were ushered through. Illyra kept her head down, though she felt the eyes upon her like hands. Her scars did not disappear in the capital. They became more visible, not because the people were crueler, but because they had never seen someone like her. Here, difference was spectacle. It was something to categorize, to whisper about behind fans and wine glasses. They led her to a room that smelled of too much perfume and not enough air, where a girl no older than 10 lay motionless beneath a veil of embroidered silk. The child's face was bone pale, her breast shallow, eyelids fluttering as though even in unconsciousness she battled unseen terrors. Beside her sat a man, young, dressed in black trimmed with silver, his expression drawn and unrelenting. This was Nikolai, prince, brother, guardian of a realm and a child's fragile life. He stood when Illyra entered, though his eyes did not rise to her face. They stopped at her hands, at the leather-wrapped satchel, at the silence she carried like a blade. The girl's name was Felice. It meant happiness, or so the prince had whispered as Illyra stepped into the chamber and placed her satchel on the velvet cushioned stool beside the child's bed. There was bitter irony in the naming, because nothing about the child's face resembled joy. Her skin, once likely the color of soft cream, had turned ashen, her cheeks sunken with illness, her lips tinged faintly blue. She did not stir beneath the pile of silks and linens that had been artfully arranged around her, more display than a comfort, and her breath came shallow and irregular, as though she were sinking through a dream she could no longer swim to the surface of. Ilara had seen this fever before, not in a royal bedchamber with sconces shaped like lions' heads and glass chandeliers glittering coldly above, but in a wooden cot in a thatched roof home where a woman had cradled her dying niece and asked, not with words but with eyes, for a mercy beyond hope. This fever stole gently at first, whispering itself into bones before winding tightly around the lungs, the heart, the mind. It disguised itself as sleep, then slowly deepened into silence. The body remained, but the soul began to wander too far, too fast. It was not a sickness that could be starved or burned out. It required coaxing in time and a kind of understanding that few allowed themselves to believe in anymore. The prince did not leave her side as she examined the girl. His silence was tense, weighted. He stood just behind her shoulder, arms crossed over his chest, the dark lines beneath his eyes speaking of nights without rest. Ilara reached for Felice's wrist and took the child's pulse with her fingers. 3 heartbeats, too fast, then a pause, then fluttering like a trapped bird. She watched the movement of Felice's eyes beneath her lids. Rapid, darting. Dreams, but not the kind that comforted. This child was caught somewhere between here and gone. She unwrapped the layers from the girl's body with deliberate hands, ignoring the subtle inhale of disapproval from the lady-in-waiting who stood in the corner like an ornament beneath the fine silks. Felice was sweating through her shift, her skin clammy and hot to the touch, but her limbs were cold at the edges. Ilara placed her palms gently on either side of the girl's head, closing her own eyes. There was something moving through her, not an infection of the body alone, but of the spirit, a kind of grief that had been allowed to root deep, as though the child had opened herself to loss before she was strong enough to carry it. Ilara had seen this too, in the orphanage, in herself. Without a word, she began to unpack her tools. Glass vials wrapped in cloth, small bundles of dried leaves tied with twine, a shallow bowl made from dark clay. She crushed chamomile and valerian in the bowl with a stone pestle, added powdered marshmallow root for its cooling properties, and steeped the mixture in hot water that a servant brought at her signal. Then, from a small silver box at the very bottom of her satchel, she withdrew a vial of moonflower oil, milky, opalescent, and faintly fragrant, like something remembered from a dream. It was the most precious tincture she owned, drawn from a flower that only bloomed once a year under a waning moon and wilted before dawn. She had harvested it alone, barefoot beneath the stars, hands trembling with reverence. She added 3 drops to the tea and stirred. Then she turned to the prince. "She must drink this," she said, her voice low and even. "It will draw her back from wherever she's gone. But it must be her choice to return. I cannot force her." "She cannot hear you," Nikolai said, his voice cracking beneath its calm. "She hasn't spoken in days." Ilara met his eyes for the first time. They were the eyes of a man used to issuing commands, not receiving truths he could not shape. "She hears," Ilara said softly. "They always hear." He did not argue. He sat beside his sister and lifted her gently, one arm supporting her head. Ilara pressed a cup to the child's lips and tilted it slowly. The liquid touched her mouth, and for a moment, there was nothing. Then a swallow, weak, almost imperceptible. But it was enough. Ilara's breath loosened in her chest. She stepped back, letting the prince hold her, letting the oil and herbs seep through the girl's veins and into the space where dreams tangled with memory. Time passed slowly. Minutes stretched long. The fire in the hearth cracked but gave no warmth. The other women in the chamber whispered, pacing. The prince did not move, did not release his sister's hand. Ilara sat cross-legged on the rug, hands folded in her lap, eyes closed, as if in prayer, though she had never learned the proper words for it. It was almost dusk when the change came. Felice's breath deepened. Her lashes fluttered. Her lips moved. She whispered something too soft to catch. Then her eyes opened, Slowly, unfocused at first, then wide and panicked. She clutched at her brother's arm, breath hitching. "Nico," she said, her voice dry and cracked. "I was falling. There was a river made of glass. I couldn't find you." He broke then. The prince, who had stood like stone for days, unmoving, unyielding, crumbled before her in a silence more raw than any wail. He buried his face against the child's hair and said nothing, but his hands shook as they held her. Ilara stood quietly, her knees stiff on the floor. She stepped away, letting them be, letting grief and relief have the space they needed. A servant tried to approach her, to offer a towel, a coin, perhaps a kind word. But Ilara waved her off. She had no need for ceremony. She did not want to be thanked. She had only wanted the girl to live. Later, as night fell fully and the city outside flickered with torchlight, the prince came to her chamber. He had washed his face, but the strain had not left his shoulders. He did not speak for a while. She was seated near the window, sorting the vials back into their satchel. "I do not understand what you did," he said finally, "but I know I've never seen anything like it." "It was not me," she replied. She chose to return. "I only gave her the path." He studied her for a long time, as if trying to see past the scars, past the stories that must have preceded her name before it ever reached the capital. She could feel it, the weight of his gaze, not the pitying glance of a stranger, not the recoil of superstition, but something different, something searching. "They warned me you were unusual," he said, the word chosen carefully. "But no one told me you were like this." "Like what?" she asked, still focused on her hands. "Like someone who listens more than she speaks. Someone who moves through the world as if it were wounded and still chooses to tend it." She looked up then, met his eyes. "Because it is wounded," she said, "and so am I." There was no shame in the admission, only a quiet truth, shared and understood. He did not respond. He stepped forward and placed something in her hand. A pendant of gold, small and weighty, the symbol of his house. "For when you choose to return," he said. Ilara did not answer. Not then, but she held the pendant tightly. And in her heart, something strange stirred. Not pride, not longing, but recognition. She had never been seen like this before. And deep in the corners of her mind, in the places where memory curled and bloomed, she could already feel the shift of wind, the pull of paths that had long been closed, now opening. Paths that did not belong to healers alone, but to those brave or foolish, enough to follow a trembling thread of connection all the way to its source. Ilara returned to the glen beneath the heavy breath of dawn, cloaked in the cold gray light that always came before the first birds began to sing. The path home had never felt so long. Though the city lay only 3 days behind her, it seemed to belong to another life entirely, a life of draped halls, whispered gratitude, and eyes that stare but didn't flinch. She had walked through corridors of painted ceilings and slept in a bed carved from cedarwood, but none of it followed her here. The velvet had stayed behind. The polished voices, the eyes lined with powder and power, the weight of a prince's pendant in her satchel. They belonged to another version of her, one she was not yet ready to look at in full. Here, the earth reclaimed her in silence. The house was as she had left it, though the ivy had thickened on the northern wall, and a raccoon had torn through the compost pile near the gate. She noticed these things with an odd sharpness, the way one does after a long journey when the familiar no longer fits perfectly but presses back with unfamiliar angles. The wooden door creaked under a palm, dry from the summer air, and inside, the fire had long since gone cold. A bowl of dried lavender still sat by the hearth, brittle and brown at the edges. Bram's cup, carved from antler, rested on the shelf untouched. She found his cloak draped across the bench, but no sign of the man himself. It was not like him to be gone so early. She stepped back outside, the grass wood against her feet, and turned toward the garden. The foxglove was taller now, arching above the path like something protective. The mint had overtaken its corner, spilling wild into the yarrow, and she noted with strange ache how the moonwort had finally bloomed, pale and trembling beneath the sycamore. She crouched beside it, brushing her fingers along the stem, and felt the soft electric hum of the plant's life echo in her palm. The world here was slower, closer to the rhythm of breath and root. The city had not changed that. but something inside her had bent, subtly, irrevocably. She found Bram just beyond the garden wall, seated on a flat stone where she often dried herbs in the summer heat. His back was to her, the early light casting long shadows from his shoulders. He turned slightly when he heard her approach, but not fully. His sightless eyes moved to the sound of her footsteps. "You came back," he said simply. "I said I might," she replied. "And yet you brought the air of somewhere else with you." Elara didn't respond right away. She lowered herself beside him and stared out at the horizon, where the trees folded into the mist. "She lived," she said finally. "The child. Felice." She woke. Bram gave a slow nod. "You knew she would." "I hoped," she corrected. "Hope is not the same." They sat in silence for a while, broken only by the crows that called from the ash tree and the far-off trickle of water down the ravine. She wanted to tell him everything, about the chamber's hush, the prince's quiet unraveling, the way her name had been spoken without mockery, but the words felt thick in her mouth. She did not know how to describe the weight of being needed in a place that had never imagined her, or the tremor of being seen not as strange, but as necessary. And deeper still, she did not know how to name the thing that had stirred when Nikolai placed the pendant in her hand and said nothing more. She touched it now, through the fabric of her satchel. The gold was still warm, as if it had absorbed the prince's fear, his relief, his wordless offering. "He asked me to stay," she said. Bram turned his head. "In the city?" She nodded. "He didn't demand it. He only left the door open." "And what did you tell him?" "I didn't," she answered. "I left before the question could find its shape." She felt him exhale beside her, long and measured. "The forest will not ask you to choose, but the world will." She looked down at her hands, scarred, freckled, dirt under the nails even now. These hands had held roots and fevered brows, bound wings and stitched torn flesh. They were not delicate, they were not royal, but they had brought life back from the edge more times than she could count. They were hers. "Does that mean I cannot belong to both?" she asked quietly. "The woods and the world?" "It means," Bram said, "that belonging has never been about where you stand, but how you carry what you've learned into where you go next." She said nothing to that, but the words settled in her like seeds in loam. That afternoon, the villagers returned. They did not come in crowds, and they did not knock. One by one, in pairs or with children tucked in shawls, they stepped out from the trees or emerged from the long grass, hesitant but steady. A cough that would not ease, a rash that blistered beneath the sun, a man who had swallowed ash from a fire and could not speak above a whisper. They came, not with coins, not with prayers, but with the quiet reverence of those who had begun to understand. She did not welcome them with fanfare. She opened her door. She made the tea. She laid cloth soaked in balm across their skin and spoke the names of herbs in a voice that did not waver. And still, beneath it all, the memory of the city pulsed in her like a second heartbeat. She could not forget it. The way the prince's eyes had changed when Felice breathed. The way his voice had softened when he said her name. Elara, not healer, not witch, just Elara, as if it belonged to something worthy. One evening, a week after her return, a boy from the outer farms brought her a folded scrap of paper. It bore no crest this time, only a single line in a hurried hand. Asterisk, the Queen Mother asks after you. A bed is made ready. Should you wish it. Asterisk. She turned the paper over once, then again, and folded it slowly into her palm. She said nothing to the boy. Sent him home with a pouch of crushed thyme for his mother's cough. Later that night, when the stars had gathered thick over the glen, and the moon lit the path like a blade of pearl, Elara walked to the hollow in the old tree. She had not visited it since returning. Inside, the objects still lay where she had left them. Feather, spoon, shards of blue glass, the old doll with his lopsided head. She added one more now, the gold pendant nestled beside the rest. Not discarded, not hidden, held. She sat beside the tree for a long while, feeling the hum of its roots in the soil beneath her, listening to the wind shift through the leaves in a language older than sorrow. Her scars tingled in the night air, not from pain, but from memory. They had never burned in the city. They had not vanished either. They had simply become part of her story, unspoken but known. And perhaps that was all she had ever wanted, not to be healed, but to be understood. As she rose to return to the cottage, her fingers still dusty from bark and moss, she felt the unmistakable pull of something just beyond the trees. Not a threat, a presence, waiting, watching, and she knew, without being told, that the world was not done calling her forward. He arrived just after first frost, when the earth was beginning to harden beneath the weight of coming winter, and the trees stood bare and brittle as bones. The sky that morning had been low and pale, the kind of sky that seemed to watch rather than weep, and Alara had risen early to gather the last of the root vegetables before the ground became too stubborn to give. She had dirt beneath her fingernails and the sharp tang of wild onion on her skin when she heard the hoofbeats approaching, steady, not hurried, the kind that marked patience rather than urgency. She did not rise at once. She stood with her hands full of soil and silence, letting the sound come closer, letting it arrive on its own terms. By now, she had learned the shape of expectation, and she recognized in the rhythm of the horse's gait. When she turned, Nikolai was already dismounting, his cloak drawn tight against the wind, his breath visible in short bursts. He wore no crown, no emblem save the silver stitching along his collar, but he carried himself with the quiet surety of a man who had grown used to being listened to, even when he did not speak. He looked older than he had weeks ago, less tired, but changed, as though something within him had realigned. His face was no longer drawn tight with grief, but carried the worn expression of someone who had passed through grief's fire and emerged not untouched, but burnished. Alara did not greet him with surprise. She set her basket on the bench by the gate, wiped her hands on the hem of her apron, and looked at him plainly. "You found your way?" "I never forgot it," he replied, and there was no smugness in the words, only a truth worn soft by distance. He stepped closer then, and she did not move away. The air between them was cold but pulsing, a silence born not of discomfort, but of waiting. "I came without a procession," he said. "No guards, no servants. I needed the words to be mine, not theirs." Ilara's gaze lingered on his boots, already dusted with frost. "Then speak them." Nikolai studied her for a long moment. In the forest light, her scars looked like runes, etched not by violence but by intention. He had never asked about them. Not in the city, not in the haze of his sister's recovery. Now, he did not need to. They were part of the landscape, not of her face alone, but of her story. "You brought her back," he said softly. "And not just her body. She laughs now. She runs. She asks questions I can't answer and makes the nursemaids weep from exhaustion. You gave her something I couldn't. I thought it was gratitude that brought me here, but it's more than that. It always was." He paused, his jaw tight. "I want you to come back with me. Not as healer, not as guest, as my wife." The words landed without ceremony. They fell into the space between them like stones into still water, breaking the surface, stirring the depth. Alara said nothing. She did not blink. Her heart did not race. Instead, something within her became unbearably quiet, as though the world itself had stopped to listen. "I know what it means," Nikolai continued. To ask you. I know what they say, what they would say, that your face would frighten the court, that your roots lie in dirt and shadow, not in marble and light. But I have walked among those who call themselves noble, and I have not seen in them the courage I saw in you. You looked into my sister's dying and did not flinch. You saw past my title and did not kneel. You do not need a crown, Alara, but the crown needs you." She turned away then, not in fear, but to think. She walked slowly toward the edge of the garden, where the men had curled into itself for winter and the trees stood bare. Her breath came in slow clouds. She remembered the years of silence, the way children had laughed behind their hands, the nights she'd slept with her fingers curled around roots, speaking to the earth because the world above it refused her voice. She remembered the hollow in the tree where she kept her treasures, small truths, unspoken but enduring. "You ask something easy and something impossible," she said without turning. "To be with you, yes, perhaps that could be simple, but to live in that world, among those who see only what lies on the surface, that is a different kind of trial. I have already lived a life where I was watched like a wound. I do not wish to become spectacle again. I won't let them make you one, Nikolai said, stepping to her side. I can't promise ease, but I can promise truth. I can promise a life built on something more than duty. She studied him, and if I said no, he smiled faintly, and in that smile was sorrow and acceptance. Then I would thank you for the part of your life you already gave. I would leave, and the world will remain changed by your presence, even if mine was not allowed to remain near it. Ilara was not a woman given to impulse. Her life had been shaped by long patience, by waiting for plants to bloom, for fevers to break, for trust to build in slow degrees. She did not speak until the frost beneath her boots began to crack in the rising sun. I will come, she said at last, but not to live behind stone walls and speak only when summoned. I will bring my roots, my garden. I will walk the villages and tend the fields. If I am to wear your name, then it will be worn beside the names of those who came before me, my grandmother, the midwife, the child who healed the falcon. I will not be made into something other. Nikolai's expression did not falter. Then come as yourself, he said. Come as the woman who saw beauty in broken wings. That is the only woman I've asked for. They left 2 days later. Bram watched them from the edge of the path, his face unreadable but his stance easy. He placed one hand on Ilara's shoulder and said only, "Do not let their world unmake what this one taught you." She nodded. She pressed her forehead to his for the briefest moment, and then turned away before she could feel the weight of leaving. The journey to the capital was quieter this time, not because of dread, but because of gravity. Ilara carried not only her satchel, but her convictions, her memories, her scars, her herbs folded in cloth and sealed with wax. She carried her silence and her voice, and both were equal parts of her strength. When they entered the city gates, people stared again, but not with cruelty. This time, there were murmurs. A child whispered to her mother, "That's the one who saved the princess." A woman dipped her head, not low, but deep enough to mean respect. The palace had not changed. The stone was still cold. The chandeliers still glittered like distant stars. But when Ilara walked through its halls, the air shifted, doors opened. Servants watched her not with fear, but with the slow curiosity that precedes admiration. In the throne room, Nikolai stood before his council and spoke her name, not as request, but as truth. This is Ilara of the Glen. She has healed what our gold could not. She has brought back what even kings cannot command. She is not here for your approval. She is here for her own choosing. That night, she walked the gardens in silence, bare feet pressing into the marble paths. The moon hung low, its light pooling on her shoulders. She stopped beneath the arch of ivy and stared up at the stars, not to ask for answers, but to remember the girl who once whispered at trees and believed they whispered back. She had not abandoned that girl. She had brought her here. Ho! And somewhere in the rooms behind her, Felice laughed in her sleep, and Ilara knew the garden would bloom again, even here. The palace changed slowly, not through decree or spectacle, but by the quiet erosion of habits that had long gone unchallenged. It began with small things. An herb garden planted in a narrow courtyard, once used only for winter firewood. Its soil turned by Ilara's own hands. Its beds lined with thyme, valerian, and foxglove. The courtiers frowned at first, and used to seeing their silks brush against mint and marigold. But over time they stopped flinching at the scent of sage that followed her through the halls. The servants whispered that the new queen rose with the dawn and worked the earth herself, bare-handed, her cloak still damp with morning mist. They whispered that she brewed her own teas, that she visited the sick not with attendants but with linen bundles and a calm voice. Soon enough, the whispers turned into quiet reverence, and after a time, even that softened into something deeper, something approaching love. The children were the first to understand her. They watched with wide eyes as she taught them to recognize leaves by their taste and texture, showed them how to strip a nettle of its sting, how to press a wounded knee with comfrey, and wrap it with cool flax. She let them gather snails in the garden, scolded them gently when they tried to eat green berries, and held their hands when they came to her with questions they were too afraid to ask their parents. They brought her broken birds and twisted doll arms, and she never turned them away. She took them seriously in a world that seldom did. And so they gave her their trust, freely and without demand. In time, the nobles followed, reluctantly at first, then with increasing sincerity. It began when the youngest son of Lord Turon fell ill with a sickness the physicians could not name. Ilara spent 3 nights by his bedside, grinding a bitter root into honey and whispering lullabies from her childhood while he slept. The boy recovered, and Turon, once the loudest voice against her marriage to Prince, sent her a hand-carved mortar in gratitude. Others followed. Letters arrived from distant baronies, requesting guidance, asking for herbs, asking for her. No longer was she the scarred girl from the glen. She was something else now, unnameable but indispensable. And Nikolai, true to his word, never asked her to become anything other than herself. He stood beside her in the council chambers, listened when she spoke of famine and field rot and the old sicknesses that slept in shallow soil. He took her advice on matters of coin and harvest, even when others resisted. In private, he kissed the corners of her mouth where the scars curled deepest and never once asked her to hide them. He walked with her through the frostbitten gardens and bent to smell the rosemary she had planted beside the walls, not because he understood the herb's value, but because it mattered to her. They did not speak often of love, not in the way the poets described, with gasps and tears and proclamations. Theirs was not a love made of fireworks. It was a slow-burn fire, the kind that never flickered, even in wind. It lived in glances across crowded rooms, in the way his hand found hers beneath a table, in the silent offering of a cloak when the air turned cold. It lived in shared silences, in laughter that came not easily but earnestly. It lived in the fact that neither tried to remake the other. Felice flourished under Ilara's care, no longer a fragile shadow in a silken bed. She became a bright, curious girl with mud on her hem and questions always on her tongue. She followed Ilara like a second shadow, helping her sort dried petals and count seeds into jars. She called her sister one morning, without thought or hesitation, and though Ilara said nothing at the time, she later stood alone in the garden and wept for the girl she had once been, who had no sister, no name, and no home. Still, not all welcomed her presence. There were whispers, always whispers. In the corners of the court, behind closed doors, beneath layers of etiquette and courtesy, there remained those who could not see past her past. They spoke of the scars, called them omens, called them curses. They accused her of forest sorcery, of old blood that should not have been allowed near the throne. Once, someone painted a symbol of warding on her chamber door. Another time, a glass vial of dead moths was left in her dressing basin. She did not report these things. She buried them in the soil with the rest of the old pain. But she did not forget. Instead, she endured. She planted more. She taught more. She walked among the common folk as though she had never left. She sat with the dying. She sang with the living. She wrote letters in her own hand to village healers, to girls who had been cast out for knowing too much about roots and wounds. She invited them to the palace. She gave them work. She gave them names. Years passed and the garden grew. It spread beyond the courtyard, beyond the eastern walls, curling up trellises and winding along the paths between wings of the palace. Fruit trees were planted. Beehives were brought in. Medicinal herbs lined perimeters where guards once stood idle. A glass house was built at her request, where rare plants from far-off regions could be grown and studied. The palace no longer smelled of wax and damp stone. It smelled of basil, of crushed thyme, of honeysuckle in bloom. People began to speak of the queen not as a figurehead, but as a force. They said her hands could soothe storms from a child's chest, that her eyes saw things other doctors missed. They said her presence calmed even the most fractured minds, that her scars glowed in moonlight when she walked alone through the orchard paths. The stories grew, as stories do, but she never corrected them. She understood that sometimes people needed myth to make room for truth. When the great fire swept to the western villages during the 7th year of her reign, she rode there herself, not in a carriage, on horseback, with her satchel tied behind her, and her cloak streaked with ash before the first ember had finished burning. She stood with the farmers as they watched their homes collapse into blackened husks. She opened the granaries, overrode the council, and made them deliver bread. She knelt in soot, wrapped scorched hands, buried the dead. When the rains came 3 days later and extinguished the last embers, she stood beneath the sky and let the water wash the ash from her skin. The people called her the Ashborn Queen after that, and they meant it not as insult but as kinship. One evening, long after the fires had faded and the harvest returned, Elara stood at the highest tower of the palace, the one that overlooked both forest and field. She stood alone, her hands wrapped around the stone balustrade, her hair unbound, her breath visible in the cool autumn air. Below her, the garden shimmered in the moonlight. Further out, torchlight flickered in the windows of homes she had once only imagined from afar. She thought of the child she had been, the one born beneath frost and silence, who had grown up with dirt under her nails and laughter always just out of reach. She thought of the falcon, of Bram, of the midwife who had held her without fear, of the prince who had knelt before her not in pity, but in reverence. And then she thought of the girl who had once asked, in the silence of forest clearing, if she would ever be more than what others said she was. She had not answered then. Now she did. She spoke the words aloud, her voice steady as wind. You were always enough. And the stars above her shimmered in answer, and the trees beyond the garden leaned closer, and somewhere in the palace below, a child stirred in her sleep and whispered the queen's name, not in fear, but in peace.